Late at night, Peppa and George were still awake. They sat on the floor of their bedroom, building a tower out of blocks and laughing. Outside stretched the darkness, the wind rustling through the branches of the trees. But suddenly the room grew colder. At first, just a faint draft, then an icy current of air that made the toys on the shelves begin to sway. "Peppa, I'm scared," George whispered. The toys began to move. Cars rolled across the floor on their own. The teddy bear lifted its paw, and a doll tilted its head so sharply that its neck cracked. Peppa pulled her brother close and felt the walls begin to change. The drawings on the wallpaper came alive. Flowers stretched into black, writhing lines like shadows, creeping slowly upward. The bedroom door creaked and swung open. A silhouette appeared on the threshold. It looked like Daddy Pig, but twisted, like a reflection in a warped mirror. His body was covered with green growths, like avocados, and his arms were massive and powerful, like those of a gorilla. His eyes glowed a dim red. This was the avocado gorilla. He leaned forward and spoke in a deep voice. "Let's play a game. Stay absolutely still until morning. Any movement, and you lose." Peppa and George froze where they were. In the corridor behind him appeared the figures of Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig. But they were not their parents. Their faces were lifeless, their smiles too wide, and their eyes were empty, black voids. They stood motionless, staring directly at the children. The house began to distort. The ceiling rose higher, the walls stretched, and new doors appeared, doors that had never been there before. One opened on its own, revealing only fog and the sound of heavy footsteps. The air grew thick and cold, and the lamp overhead flickered as if it were breathing in rhythm with Peppa's heart. "I can see you," the avocado gorilla said, his voice echoing as if from inside the house itself. "Whether you stand still, whether you breathe too loudly, I will notice." George gripped his sister's hand so tightly, Peppa's fingers turned white. She didn't dare move. It seemed the shadows on the walls were watching them, waiting to catch even the slightest twitch. Minutes dragged on endlessly. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind sounded like thunder. Time itself felt frozen. Peppa knew that if she flinched even once, the game would end, and the end would be terrible. When the clock hands finally crept past dawn, the figures began to fade. The avocado gorilla slowly dissolved like smoke. The shadows sank back into the walls, and the drawings on the wallpaper turned ordinary again. The room returned to normal, but Peppa and George knew it hadn't been a dream. It was a test. The next morning, their parents acted as if nothing had happened. Mummy made breakfast. Daddy read his paper. Peppa wanted to ask about the night, but stayed silent. They remembered nothing. Or maybe they simply didn't want to. A day later, the family went to Grandpa Pig's farm. Peppa was excited about the trip, but unease gnawed at her. From the very moment they approached, she noticed everything was different. The trees seemed taller than before, their branches weaving into a heavy canopy. The ground was soft, almost damp, and every step released the smell of rot. The farm was silent. The usual chatter of animals was gone. The barn was empty, the shed stood open, but inside there wasn't a sound. Even the ducks on the pond sat motionless, like statues. Grandpa Pig greeted them with a smile, but his eyes were strange. In them glowed the same red light Peppa had seen in the avocado gorilla. "Welcome," he said. "Today we'll play a game too." The family stood in the middle of the yard, surrounded by fog. The houses and trees around the farm seemed to blend together into one vast living creature. Peppa felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, and in that trembling she heard the familiar breathing of the avocado gorilla. She squeezed George's hand and realized the game was not over. Their home, their farm, their world, it had already changed. The avocado gorilla was watching them, and now He was everywhere. The Labubu toy Peppa found a strange toy in an old chest in the attic. A small figure with big dark eyes and a wide smile. It had a tag, Labubu. The toy was soft but cold to the touch, as if it had been kept in a freezer for a long time. "Can I take it to my room?" Peppa asked Mummy Pig. "Of course, dear. But wash it first, it's very dusty." Peppa took Labubu to her room and placed it on the shelf next to her other toys. The toy stared straight ahead with an unmoving gaze. Something about its smile seemed wrong, too wide for such a small face. At night, Peppa woke up to a strange sound, quiet rustling, as if someone was crawling on the floor. She turned on the nightlight and looked around the room. Everything was in its place, but Labubu had disappeared from the shelf. "Where is it?" Peppa muttered, getting out of bed. She found the toy under the bed, lying on its side. Strange! How could it have gotten there? Peppa picked up Labubu and put it back on the shelf. The toy seemed heavier than before, and its smile had become even wider. The next day, Peppa was playing with George in the living room. Suddenly, she heard the patter of little feet upstairs. "Mummy, someone's walking in my room," Peppa said. "There's no one there, dear. Maybe it's mice." But when Peppa went up to her room, Labubu was not on the shelf again. This time, it was standing in the middle of the room, turned toward the door. Its pose was as if it had been waiting for Peppa. "How did you get here?" Peppa whispered, carefully approaching the toy. Labubu was silent, but its eyes seemed to follow Peppa's every movement. The girl quickly grabbed the toy and put it back on the shelf, but this time turned it to face the wall. At night, the rustling repeated, but now it was louder. Peppa woke up and saw that Labubu was standing by her bed, looking straight at her. In the darkness, its eyes glowed with a faint greenish light. "What do you want from me?" Peppa whispered, not daring to move. The toy didn't answer, but slowly raised one hand, as if it wanted to touch Peppa. The girl screamed and turned on the light. Labubu instantly became an ordinary toy lying on the floor. "Mummy! Daddy! What happened?" asked Mummy Pig, running into the room. "Labubu! It was moving! It was standing by my bed! It's just a toy, dear! It can't move!" But Peppa saw the truth in Labubu's dark eyes. The next day, she tried to throw the toy away, but it kept returning to her room. First in the trash can, then in the garden, even when Peppa took it to the neighbors. Labubu always found its way back. It began appearing in the most unexpected places. In Peppa's school bag, in the refrigerator, even in the bathroom. Each time its smile became wider and its eyes brighter. One night, Peppa woke up and found that all her toys had lined up in a row, looking at the bed. And in the center stood Labubu, like a commander of an army. "Now you understand," whispered a voice that seemed to come from all the toys at once. "I'm not just a toy, I'm a collector. And now you're part of my collection." Peppa wanted to scream but couldn't move. Her body was becoming stiffer, like a toy. She felt her skin turning to plastic and her thoughts slowing down. "Don't worry," said Labubu, coming closer. "Being a toy isn't so bad. You'll play forever. With me." In the morning, Mummy Pig found a new toy in Peppa's room, very similar to her daughter. It stood on the shelf next to Labubu, with the same wide smile and motionless gaze. "Strange, I don't remember buying this toy," Mummy Pig muttered, adjusting the little dress of the toy Peppa, and Labubu stood nearby, its smile even wider. Now it had a friend, forever. But Labubu's collection wasn't complete yet. In the evening, it heard George playing in the next room. It was time to find a new friend. Morning in Peppa Pig's house began differently than usual. She opened her eyes and immediately felt something was wrong. The room looked familiar, but the air was heavy, pressing, filled with a suffocating silence. George lay beside her, hugging his dinosaur, but she couldn't even hear his breathing. Peppa carefully got up and went downstairs. Normally, at this time, Mummy Pig would be making breakfast and the house would be filled with the smell of porridge. But now, a different smell greeted her. Cold, empty, like a room where no one had lived for a very long time. Her family was waiting in the living room. Mummy, Daddy, and George sat on the sofa. They didn't move, they didn't speak. Their eyes were completely empty, like two black ovals, without reflection, without life. On their faces was the same wide, identical smile. They turned their heads toward Peppa all at once, and there was nothing natural in that movement. Peppa took a step back, and at that moment the television turned on by itself. The screen flickered, showed static, and then her reflection. Only it wasn't hers. The face on the screen was distorted, the eyes too big, the mouth twisted, and most terrifying of all, it didn't move the way she did. When Peppa blinked, the reflection kept staring with wide, unblinking eyes. When she raised her hoof, her copy did the same, but with a delay and at a strange angle, like a puppet pulled on strings. Sound filled the room. It wasn't a voice, and it wasn't music. It was a jumble of distorted phrases, spoken backwards. They overlapped, merging into a droning noise that made her ears ache. Peppa covered them with her hooves, but the sound continued inside her head. Her family stood up from the sofa and took a step forward. Their movements were synchronized, which made it even more terrifying. Peppa ran upstairs into her room and slammed the door shut. But the mirror in her bedroom was already waiting for her. Inside was the same copy from the screen. It was moving faster now, scratching at the glass with its hooves from the inside. Cracks spread across the surface, and its lips began to move. At first, silently. Then, through the crackling, she heard words, backwards and barely recognizable. "Let me in." The mirror splintered. In panic, Peppa pulled back, clutching the doorknob. And at that instant, everything fell silent again. The silence was thick, buzzing. She slowly went downstairs. The kitchen greeted her with a new, horrifying sight. Sitting right on the table was Labubu. Her favorite toy had always seemed harmless, but now it looked different. Its eyes were hollow, black, and its smile stretched too wide, as if the fabric of its face was ready to rip apart. In Labubu's paws was George's torn dinosaur. Threads hung from it, and the plastic body was twisted into an unnatural pose. Peppa froze, unable to move. Labubu slowly lifted its head. Its mouth didn't move, but a long hissing sound came from within. Then it stretched its tiny paw toward Peppa. Fear paralyzed her. She felt she couldn't scream, couldn't run. Labubu tilted its head slightly, as if saying, "You knew it would come to this." She felt the walls of the house begin to tremble. Lights flickered on in the corridor by themselves. Shadows stretched across the walls, too long, moving as if they were copying her every gesture. The television turned on again, and this time the distorted Peppa didn't just appear on the screen. It began to crawl halfway out. Its lips stretched into a grin, and it winked. Peppa covered her face with her hooves. She understood this day would not end. It would repeat again and again. And Labubu, sitting on the table, was there to make sure of it. His eyes glowed red. His smile stretched even wider. He was waiting. On an ordinary evening in Peppa Pig's cozy home, as the sun had set behind the horizon, the twilight deepened and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky. Inside the house, everything was peaceful. Mummy Pig was putting away things in the kitchen. Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper in the living room. In the children's bedroom, Peppa and her younger brother George were getting ready for bed. They were laughing, sharing toys, and everything felt just like any other night. But their peace was interrupted by a strange sound. From under the wooden floor of their bedroom came a scratching noise. It wasn't the usual rustling of mice or the creak of old boards. The sounds were rhythmic, as if something was scratching the wood with long claws, pausing and then repeating. Peppa and George froze. Their little hearts were beating faster, in sync with the eerie scraping sound. "Did you hear that?" whispered Peppa. George nodded, clutching his pillow tighter. They tried to stay still, listening for any other noises. The scratching faded, then returned, growing closer each time. It felt as if some invisible creature was slowly moving beneath their bedroom. Night had fully descended when Peppa suddenly woke up. The room was filled with absolute, dead silence, which was far more terrifying than any sound. Then she heard it. Muffled, heavy footsteps, as if something huge and invisible was walking directly under them. Each step echoed like a dull thud. After that, a low knock followed, then a deep, intermittent breathing, filling the room with icy air. Peppa cautiously shook George. He sleepily opened his eyes but immediately widened them when he heard a new sound, the slow creak of wood. One of the old floorboards slowly lifted. Peppa held her breath. Two long, unnaturally thin limbs, black as charred wood, emerged from beneath it. They looked like twisted branches of an ancient tree but moved too consciously and deliberately. The deer monster's hands slowly groped the surface of the floor, every motion graceful, almost elegant. The children watched in terror as the fingers slid across the wood, as though searching for a gap to grasp and crawl out. George squeezed his eyes shut, clutching the blanket. Peppa, trembling, couldn't tear her eyes away. It seemed as though the black fingers lingered by her bed, as if sensing her breath. In an instant, the hands disappeared as quietly as they had appeared. The board lowered back into place, and the room sank into silence again. But on the floor remained dark, sticky marks like traces of resin. "Mummy!" George exhaled, his voice so faint that Peppa barely heard him. They didn't dare call for their parents. It felt like making even the slightest sound would bring the hands back. Peppa and George sat together, holding each other tightly, waiting. But sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the house made them flinch. Just before dawn, when the first light filtered through the curtains, Peppa dared to get out of bed. Where the hands had moved during the night, the floorboard was damp and cold. Faint, dark prints were visible, thin lines like patterns of branches leading deeper into the crack. Peppa looked up and noticed a new crack in the wall. It stretched upwards, as if the tree was trying to break into the room. George approached her, and they froze. From the crack came a faint, barely audible whisper. The deer monster had returned to the darkness of the crawl space, but it had not left. It was waiting. A gift for George. George really wanted a new toy. His favorite dinosaur had broken, and the boy was sad all day long. Mummy Pig decided to cheer up her son and took him to a new toy store on the outskirts of town. The store was strange. Dim lighting, creaky shelves, and the shopkeeper, an elderly pig with cloudy eyes, spoke very quietly, almost in a whisper. "Choose any toy, dear," said Mummy Pig. George wandered between the shelves, looking at bright toys, but his gaze was drawn to one special figure in the far corner, a small creature with big dark eyes and a wide smile. The tag read Labubu. "I want this one," said George, pointing at the toy. The shopkeeper looked strangely at the boy, then at Mummy Pig. "Are you sure? This toy is special. It requires special care." "What do you mean?" asked Mummy Pig. "Nothing special, just be attentive to the child's behavior." Mummy Pig shrugged and bought Labubu. George was delighted. He hugged the toy to himself all the way home, and Labubu seemed to look directly at him with her motionless eyes. At home, George immediately ran to his room to play with the new toy. He sat Labubu on the bed and began telling her about his favorite games. "You'll be my best friend," said George. And then it seemed to him that Labubu nodded slightly. The first few days everything was normal. George played with Labubu, carried her everywhere, even slept, hugging her. But gradually his behavior began to change. First, George became very quiet. He stopped running around the house, shouting and laughing. Instead, he sat for hours in his room, quietly talking to Labubu. "Who are you talking to in there?" asked Peppa, peeking in on her brother. "With Labubu. She tells me interesting stories." "But it's just a toy, George." "No, she's real. She talks to me." Peppa looked at the toy. Labubu sat on the bed with the same wide smile, but something about her pose seemed wrong to Peppa, as if the toy was watching her. Then George began saying strange things. He told his parents about a dark forest where Labubu lived, about other children who played there forever. He said that Labubu showed him this world in dreams. "I like it there," George said with a distant look. "It's always dark and quiet there. And no one shouts." His parents became worried. George began avoiding sunlight, preferring to sit in dark corners. He stopped eating his favorite food and barely slept at night. One night, Mummy Pig heard George talking in his room. She quietly approached the door and listened. "Yes, Labubu, I understand. I want to stay with you forever. Your world is much better." Mummy Pig entered the room. George sat on the bed holding Labubu in his hands. His eyes were wide open, but his gaze was empty, as if he was looking through his mother. "George, who are you talking to?" "With Labubu. She says she'll take me to her place soon. We'll play in her world where it's always night." Mummy Pig felt a chill. She took Labubu from her son's hands. The toy was ice cold, even though George had been holding it in his warm hands. "I think you need to rest from this toy for a while," said Mummy, and took Labubu to another room. George screamed like never before. He cried and begged to return Labubu, said he couldn't live without her. At night, Mummy Pig woke up to a strange sound, quiet footsteps in the corridor. She left the bedroom and saw George walking toward the room where Labubu lay. The boy moved strangely, like a sleepwalker. His eyes were closed. "George!" called Mummy, but the boy didn't react. He reached the room, took Labubu, and returned to his room. In the morning, he didn't remember how it happened. The parents decided to get rid of the toy. They took Labubu back to the store, but the shopkeeper only smiled mysteriously. "She'll return," he said. They always return to their children. And indeed, the next day, Labubu was back in George's room. No one knew how she got there. Each day, George became more distant. He almost stopped talking to his family, spending all his time with Labubu. His skin became pale, and his eyes lost their shine. One morning, the parents went into George's room to wake him up, but the bed was empty. Only Labubu lay on the pillow with her unchanging smile. George was nowhere to be found. The search continued for weeks, but the boy seemed to have vanished into thin air, and Labubu remained in the house, waiting for the next child who would want to play with her. It all began with something small. Peppa woke up in her room and saw the sun shining through the window just like always. George was asleep beside her, lying on his side, hugging his dinosaur. Everything seemed ordinary. From downstairs came the familiar sounds. Mummy Pig making breakfast, Daddy Pig rustling his newspaper. Peppa went down, and on the table a bowl of porridge was waiting for her, but the porridge was cold. She tasted it. It had no flavor at all, no sweetness, no salt, just emptiness. Peppa frowned but said nothing. The day passed as usual, a walk in the garden, lunch, games with George, a bedtime story, and then sleep again. The next morning, everything repeated. George lay in the same position. Mummy cooked the same breakfast. Daddy held the newspaper in the same way. And again, the porridge was cold. Peppa thought it was déjà vu, but by the third day, it was clear. This was no coincidence. George said the same word, dinosaur. Her parents repeated the same phrases. The sun fell at the same angle, and everything followed the same script. On the fourth day, Peppa decided to test it. She didn't go down for breakfast, staying in her room instead. But nothing changed. Downstairs, the same voices continued. George said the same things. Her parents didn't notice her absence, as if it had already been written that way. "Mummy," Peppa asked cautiously, "what day is it today?" Mummy Pig looked at her and smiled, too wide. "Today is today." The words sounded hollow, like an echo. Time lost all meaning. Day after day, nothing changed. Only Peppa felt the growing unease. The walls began to seem alive. The windows glowed with a flat white light, as though they weren't showing the outside world at all but painted scenery. Doors led to the same rooms but at wrong angles, as if the house was folding and unfolding on itself. On the 7th day, Peppa woke up earlier than everyone else, or so it seemed. The room was dark, though the clock said it was morning. George lay beside her, his eyes wide open. He didn't blink, he didn't breathe. But when Peppa called his name, he suddenly sat up, smiled too quickly, too perfectly, and said, "Today will be a good day, Peppa." And then he froze again. Fear gripped her. She hid under the blanket, but deep down she knew this wasn't her home anymore. Soon Daddy Pig vanished. His place at the table was empty, though the newspaper still lay on the chair. Then Mummy disappeared. Then George. No one noticed their absence. It was as if they had never existed. Only Peppa remembered. On the final day, she gathered her courage and stepped outside. What met her wasn't the world. The grass was painted flat on the ground. The trees were cardboard cutouts. The sky was nothing but a dull grey light, without sun or clouds. It all looked like a stage set. And then she heard it. A monotonous, distorted melody, like something played on a broken record. From around the corner of the house came Tralalelo Tralala. His movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. His red eyes glowed in the half-light. His mouth opened and closed, and each time that same strange tune spilled out. Tralalelo, tralala. The sound echoed through the empty world, bouncing off the walls of her mind. Peppa tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as if her feet were fused to the ground. Her thoughts grew heavy, blurred. The world around her shook, its lines smeared like wet paint. Then, among the cardboard trees, a figure appeared. Dancing, laughter pierced the grey sky, louder, sharper. It was Lirili Larilla. Her movements were graceful, spinning as if she was enjoying the nightmare. Her form broke apart into fragments, then reassembled, as if she didn't belong to this world at all. Peppa stood alone. The house behind her no longer looked like a home, but like another piece of scenery. The creatures closed in. Tralalelo Tralala stepped closer, his glowing red eyes burning brighter. Lirili Larilla's laughter rose, her silhouette trembling, about to reach out for Peppa herself. And at that moment, Peppa understood. This wasn't a dream, not déjà vu, not repetition. It was a game, their game, and she was next. It had been drizzling all day. At first, it was quiet, barely noticeable, but by evening, the rain grew heavy and relentless. Drops drummed on the roof. The windows trembled with a fine shiver. The sky was fully overcast, and the forest beyond the house seemed like an endless wall of darkness. The wind wandered through the branches, and from time to time came a creak, as if something enormous was moving through the thicket. Peppa and George sat in the living room. They tried to play with building blocks, but the tower collapsed again and again, sometimes from their clumsiness, sometimes from the pounding rain that shook the whole house. Their parents were gone. Mummy and Daddy Pig had gone to town and left dinner for the children. The house seemed cozy, but the longer the rain lasted, the more it felt as though something alien was hiding outside the windows. When the first howl came, George flinched and dropped a block. It was a long, drawn-out sound, unlike anything they had ever heard. Not wind, not an animal, something else entirely. It slid under the skin and echoed in the bones. Peppa stood up and walked to the window. Beyond the glass, she saw two enormous red lights. They glowed motionless, but so brightly that their cold radiance pierced through the rain. Peppa realized they were eyes staring straight at their house. "What is that?" George whispered, pressing against his sister. At that very moment, there was a knock at the door, slow and heavy, as if struck by a hoof. The knock came again, louder, and was joined by a dreadful scratching, sharp claws raking the wood. "Don't open it!" George pleaded, but curiosity won. Peppa's trembling hands opened the door just a crack. On the threshold stood the deer monster. His antlers stretched high, sharp as blades. His eyes burned with sinister light, and dark liquid dripped from his jaws. The creature stepped inside. Its hooves left black marks on the floor, smoke rising from each print. With every movement, the house grew colder, the lamps overhead dimmer. "You cannot leave," it rasped, voice like rusted metal scraping stone. "Now you belong to the forest." The children rushed to the windows, but they slammed shut on their own. The door behind the monster crashed closed. The house seemed alive, no longer willing to let them out. The floor quaked, the walls groaned, the ceiling cracked. The monster's antlers began to grow, splitting the beams above. Shadows in the corners stretched into shapes like long, reaching arms. Peppa grabbed George and pulled him toward the stairs. For a moment, it seemed safer upstairs, but the monster's steps thundered after them, each one shaking the walls. On the second floor, the windows no longer showed their yard. Through the glass stood tree trunks, as though the house had been carried deep into the forest. The wind howled in the corridors, and on the walls seeped patterns of moss and pine needles. Peppa and George hid in their room, but the door swung open on its own. The monster entered, its eyes lighting the walls and turning shadows into writhing beasts. "Now the house is part of the forest," it hissed. Its antlers pierced through the ceiling, and the floor was covered with a thin layer of water, as if the rain had spilled indoors. The children screamed, but their voices drowned in the roar of the storm. Everything grew darker, colder. The room dissolved, walls fading away, replaced by the rising trunks of trees. The night dragged on endlessly. Peppa and George no longer knew where their home was. In the village, or already swallowed by the woods, they clung to each other as the monster's steps and breathing echoed around them. When morning came and their parents returned, the door opened without resistance. The house was quiet. Toys lay scattered on the floor. The lights were on, but the children were gone. Only two small pairs of shoes stood neatly by the threshold. But the house was strange. The hallway smelled of resin, damp stains spread across the walls, and pine cones lay in the corner. Mummy and Daddy Pig exchanged a glance but said nothing. Since then, children's voices are sometimes heard in the forest at night. They call for help, call for home, but the path always leads deeper into the thicket, and among the trees still roams the deer monster. Sometimes in the windows of the empty house his eyes can be seen, red, unblinking, just like that night when Peppa and George opened the door.